Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Paul Goodwin. I'm the director of TrAIN, Transnational Arts Identification Research Centre. And thank you for coming for another of our TrAIN Open lectures. This evening with Michael Asbury. Before I introduce Michael, just to say that the TrAIN Open lecture is TrAIN is a cross-disciplinary research forum at the University of the Arts around the transnational, and really we investigate what happens when art crosses borders in some ways. And we do it from a variety of perspectives and disciplines: art history, curating, design history, and we investigate a number of regions, including Latin America and the Caribbean, East Asia, African diaspora, and others. Just a quick note, update on our next TrAIN lecture, just to put on your radar. We've got a very special guest, Professor Arnold Aronson from Columbia University of New York, who will be in discussion with Professor Jane Collins, who's a professor of theatre at UAL and also a member of TrAIN. And his lecture will be about theatre. It's called From Riverbed to Projections, the Ephemeral Stage, which I think will be looking at the environmental aspects of theatre production, and that will be on the 15th of March, and that will also be here. You can follow TrAIN on Facebook, on social media, Instagram, etc. And also, if you're not on our mailing list, please fill out, you'll see on your seat a form which gives you feedback. Please, if you've got some time, fill it out for us, leave your email and we'll contact you about events. So that's the next event coming up. So for today, I'm very, very pleased to welcome, again, I think this is your third TrAIN lecture or fourth? At least. Michael is, I'm sure, known to many of you here at Chelsea and beyond. He's a reader in the history and theory of arts at UAL, and of course, a founding member of TrAIN. You've been a member of TrAIN for a lot longer than I have. TrAIN is 10 years old this year. I've been director for a year. So Michael knows 13 years. How many? 13 years old, I stand corrected. And I said, Michael knows a lot more about TrAIN than I do. And he is, of course, an international authority in Brazilian modern and contemporary art. And his work really ranges across scholarly art historical work, art criticism, and curation. He's been involved in curating quite a number of important exhibitions in this area, including exhibitions at Tate Modern, Camden Art Centre, the Brazilian Embassy in London, and other areas. And some of the artists that he's looked at include Angela Ditiniso, Rafael Klein, you can see my Brazilian accent, Brazilian is very poor, Ana Maria Malino, Antonio Manuel, and many others. Of course, Helio Oiticica, who's very much involved in that exhibition at Tate Modern. Michael will be joined, so Michael will do a lecture for about 40-45 minutes, and then we have a very special guest, Dr. Fabrizio Poltronier, who's a reader in creative technologies at the Institute of Creative Technologies and the Media School in De Montfort University in Leicester. And Dr. Poltronier will be doing we're joining Michael's lecture for about 15 minutes or so, and then of course we'll open out to the questions. So this lecture effectively launches a kind of thematic strand at TrAIN, which Michael is leading. It's called Contemporary Art in Latin America, which I'm very excited about. And there'll be a number of events in this strand, including this lecture, but also this lecture comes out of a reading group that Michael has assembled at university. Some of you, I'm sure, here today are members of that reading group, which is called Historiographies of the Contemporary. And this is a group where invited scholars share their research with their peers. And there'll be a number of other events that will be coming as part of this strand. And to celebrate the launch of this strand, we'd like to invite you after the lecture downstairs for a few drinks and very cheap nibbles. It suffices, it's the time of cuts, etc. So, but please join us for a glass of wine afterwards. So the lecture today, as I'm very interested in, draws on historiography and theories of translation and departs from the following question. If contemporary art is post-conceptual art, as is often asserted by certain people from Kingston University, how should we account for current practices who come to Chelsea to do lectures? How should we account for current practices that emerge from art historical genealogies outside of that paradigm? And the question, in a way, problematises terminologies such as conceptualisms and the broader notion of global art in order to identify how such terminology arose, how to understand the contradictions they invoke, and how art historical narratives may respond to such findings. So I look forward to the discussion, and I'd like to welcome Michael Asbury to give
I think you've stolen my feet with me.
Have I?
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, as Paul mentioned, and thank you everyone for coming. But as Paul mentioned, my paper today really kind of arose out of the reading group, which is called Historiographies of the Contemporary, and it's been going for 3 years now. And so over the first year, we were looking at what is contemporary art over the decades, over the last century. So kind of a historiography of this term. And the second year, we looked at the historiography of conceptual art. And this year, we're looking at translation. So all these three themes kind of are key to my paper today, which I'll begin without further ado. So, can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'll just. The title of my paper, Historiographies of the Contemporary Modes of Translation in and from Conceptual Art, departs from two statements by the philosopher of art, Peter Osborne, who has been referred to before. The first statement argues that the term contemporary should be understood as a coming together of different but equally present temporalities. And the second statement, from another book, states that contemporary art is post-conceptual art. So in the former, Osborne appears to be in agreement with other writers on the subject, such as Giorgio Agamben, when Agamben claims that the term contemporary is inadequate when employed as a merely periodizing tool. However, if for Agamben contemporaneousness is described as, I quote, that relationship with time that adheres to it through a disjunction and an anachronism. Osborne, being interested in the contemporaneousness of art, argues that the contemporary is both a conjunction and a disjunction within the time of art history. It relates to the fact of being together in time, in the present, and the anachronistic presence of different art historical temporalities. So intrinsic in this argument is not only the very practice but the specific historical disjunction in contemporary art. It is specific for it relates to its very own genealogy, one that Osborne locates within conceptual art's rupture with abstract expressionism, and the disjunction and invocation of the early work of Marcel Duchamp, the ready-made. It is this relation that conceptual art has with its own art historical narrative that, in my opinion, enables this what I'm calling paradoxical claim to be made, that contemporary art is both defined by the coming together of different but equally present temporalities, and that it is post-conceptual art. The liberating potential that Osborne's proposition offers in terms of the validation of different temporalities in art, a kind of, for me, it kind of questions the idea of precedence, which is a problem when you're dealing with so-called kind of peripheral art movements. So this liberating potential of Osborne's proposition offers, in terms of these different temporalities, is just contradicted, in my opinion, or at the very least retracted by the claim that contemporary art is post-conceptual art. If Osborne seems to identify an important malaise within legitimizing discourses on contemporary art through the critique of the periodizing transition between the modern and the contemporary, he appears to fall victim of that very ailment itself. Duchamp thus stands as the historically disjunctive element within conceptual art, as conceptual art stands for the disjunction in contemporary art within this formulation. Yet, although we can safely claim that Duchamp owes his historical significance to a large extent to conceptual art, we can say the same, or can we say the same, about conceptual art's relation to contemporary art. The negation of contemporary art, of the contemporary as a periodizing term, is thus contradicted by a certain teleological conception of the time of art history that this equation proposes. This time of art history appears in this way more conjunctive than disjunctive, more hegemonic than discrepant. Such an affirmation raises a question, in other words, as to the possibility of envisaging within such an all-encompassing view of contemporary art, examples that do not relate to genealogies stemming from neither the rupture with abstract expressionism nor the legacies of Marcel Duchamp and conceptual art. If the first properly conceptual artworks are identified, as Peter Osborne argues, in, I quote, in the transposition of the score from music and dance into the institutional context of the gallery, and in the exhibition of documentation of performance events, then inherent to the very practice of conceptual art lies a process of translation, an operation in transmedia where the artist projects his or her work across boundaries or disciplinary boundaries. Likewise, we find Henry Flint in 1963 describing his own art as conceptual, that is, an art made of concepts and therefore language. While for Joseph Kossouff in 1969, I think, I quote, the event that made conceivable the realization that it is possible to speak another language and still make sense in art was Marcel Duchamp's first unassisted ready-made, unquote. So the affiliation is established through the figure of the ancestor who undermines the historical chronology, so that Duchamp stands more in a more contemporary context than abstract expressionism, for example. So the affiliation Duchamp is established through the figure of the ancestor who undermines the historical chronology and who provokes the disjunction, and in the specific practices of art that brings a shift from an emphasis on form and medium specificity to one generally understood as language. I mention language with caution, since I would propose that conceptual art is not strictly concerned with art as language, but as Kossouff himself put it, it relates to the possibility of speaking another language as art. That is to say, it is concerned with translation in the widest possible sense of the word. As a way of an analogy, let us think of these different but equally present temporalities of contemporary art as languages. Let us think of their coming together as a process that requires translation. Such an analogy invites a short digression, which I will make now. The Portuguese poet and writer Fernando Pessoa famously claimed through Bernardo Soares, one of his heteronyms or some literary personas, that minha pátria é a língua portuguesa. The fact that the statement, the Portuguese language is my fatherland, does not translate into English in a satisfactory way is telling. The translated form distances the subject from its object, not quite contradicting what is claimed, but stepping aside, like the author who steps aside from being himself the subject who claims such belonging, by employing a character to make the enunciation on his behalf. In the Portuguese version, we may ask, who is speaking about belonging? Fernando Pessoa or Bernardo Soares? The ambivalence is problematized in translation by Bernardo Soares' fatherland, a place where he once belonged, that he still claims to belong, but no longer inhabits. The translation celebrates that which it brings forth, that which is considered worthy of being reiterated elsewhere. Yet, at one at the same time, such an act of generosity towards the other perpetrates a betrayal. It is a betrayal that occurs through the separation that transforms the translated into an orphan of its own mother tongue and its fatherland. The translated is thus ascribed another place in which it must inhabit, only now in exile. It is this condition of exile, this orphaned state, that so easily goes unnoticed, that is naturalized by and in translation, that I wish to suggest as a possible way in which to illustrate the similar condition in which artistic languages find themselves when submitted to the so-called global art history, or as exemplified here, when they are understood under the relation that equates contemporary art with post-conceptual art. By denominating discourses of displacement as translations, I wish to emphasize their estrangement. That is to say, I want to betray the naturalness with which they are enunciated, normalized in their uprooted, orphaned state. I refer to the particular use of the term conceptualism, which is applied as a description of those distinct yet equally present artistic languages that become translated into the mother tongue of conceptual art. To consider translation as a viable means of describing the various forms of practice that constitute our understanding of conceptual art has therefore implications for other temporalities. Here, the tautology, art as idea, that conceptual art claimed for itself, or more precisely, that Joseph Kosuth claimed on its behalf, becomes in conceptualism art as translation of translation. The noun translation possesses a threefold signification, at least. One, a process of translating words or text from one language into another. Two, the conversion of something from one form or medium into another, which I'm associating with the practice of conceptual art. And three, the process of moving something from one place to another. And this third element, I'm kind of associating it with the art historical narratives that describe conceptualism as a translation of conceptual art. So as we will see, the transposition of diverse art practices into the art historical time of conceptual art through the naming of the term conceptualism involves all these three definitions. First, the act of the researcher as translator, as the translator who enables one language group access to hitherto unknown artistic practices through the translation and interpretation being another form of translation, of archival, critical, and art historical writings from the source language, so in the case of Latin America, typically Spanish or Portuguese, for example, to the target language, which predominantly is English. Second, the very practice of conceptual art as an art of and in transmedia. And third, the conjunction of these two forms of translation, the textual and the artistic, as a means of moving art practices from a peripheral condition into a mainstream cultural inhabitation. Maricame Ramirez's essay, Blueprint Circuits, Conceptual Art and Politics in Latin America, of 1993, is generally credited as the primary source for the descriptive relation that the term conceptualism holds with the diverse practices that originated in Latin America between the 1960s and 70s. Her essay, however, begins by proposing another art historical origin for that association, namely Simon Marchand Fils, who, according to Ramirez, coined the expression ideological conceptualism in 1972 as a means of differentiating what was considered the overtly tautological nature of North American conceptual art, exemplified by the, and I quote, the generalizing reductive posture of Joseph Koussouf's art as idea, unquote. Ramirez expands, however, Fitz's scope of comparison from the specific case of the Argentinian Grupo de los Trece and its relation to contemporaneous art practices in Spain to, and this is what Ramirez expanding the scope, she kind of relates it now to the art produced in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, and more generally Latin America since the mid-1960s, and their relation to art produced in the USA and to a lesser extent to in Europe. Ramirez, for Ramirez, I quote, "As with any movement originating in the periphery, the work of Latin American political conceptualist artist in its relationship with the mainstream source engages in a pattern of mutual influence and response. It is both grounded in and distant from the legacy of North American conceptualism, in that it represents the transformation of it and also anticipated in many ways the forms of ideological conceptualism developed in the late 70s and 80s by feminist and other politically engaged artists in North America and Europe." Unquote. So Ramirez proposed a reciprocity between center and periphery that is cartographic in nature and evidenced through time, whereby the language of conceptual art, the mainstream source, as she calls it, is translated into an ideological conceptualism that anticipated subsequent developments within conceptual art itself. Her essay refers to practices that emerged in locations other than the art historical genealogy to which conceptual arts is seen to belong, and the geopolitical space it inhabits. Ramirez thus establishes a relation and separation between conceptual art and conceptualism. The former as predominantly North American, the latter described by its Latin American specificity. Conceptualism as a term ascribed in retrospect must therefore be understood as a form of translation, a term that unleashes a chain of retranslations from and then back into the canon, as the mainstream. Within this process of translations, the betrayal inherent to the act is not considered as a form of loss, but on the contrary, as a positive means of differentiation. As such, conceptualism, with the benefit of historical hindsight, is defined as an art that transposed the self-reflexivity, the tautology, the passivity, and the immediacy of North American conceptual art, respectively, as contextualization, referentiality, activism, and meditation, according to Ramirez. Ramirez transposes these distortions or betrayals committed by translation back into the mainstream art history through the legitimizing anticipation of the historical progression of North American conceptual art itself. Within this relation, conceptual art remains the live language, where translation operates as both praxis and poiesis, and I'll explain these terms later on, the one that is deemed to evolve, whilst conceptualism with its specific characteristics, ideological and or didactic, precedes that evolution while not being a part of it, not recognized as a developing entity in and of itself, but instead condemned to this day to be reincarnated as the always deferred affirmation of its difference through its innate subversive marginality. That is to say, it is condemned to always be an art historical translation, a hybrid product of the strategy of negotiation with the mainstream's pure artistic trends. Difference, as far as conceptualism is concerned, seems to be the key question here, whereby that which is deemed untranslatable becomes the distinguishing marker, the identifying trait, the underlying and unifying procedural strategy. This process is commonly associated with the term hybridity, that sterile amalgam of central and peripheral elements, condemned to forever defer the resolution of its internal conflict. If we consider the terms poiesis as the poetics of making and producing art, and praxis as the action of that art within the social sphere, then we may think of translation from conceptual art to conceptualism as a betrayal of the poiesis, since conceptualism is legitimized purely on the basis of its praxis, its social political action. The normalization of the praxis of conceptualism denies any relation that the art languages, the poiesis, of those who are carried across by the enunciation, by the translation, may possess with their own forebearers. So it's like Bernardo Soares' claim when he pronounces it in English. When it is translated into English, he no longer inhabits the place to which he claims to belong. The translation uproots, exiles, and orphans its subject from their own genealogies, their mother tongues and fatherlands, while paradoxically emphasizing their identities as orphaned others, outsiders that relate but do not belong. This is evident in recollections of the exhibition that popularized and normalized the term conceptualism. Terry Smith, for example, in 2011, recounts the significance of conceptualism as far as its origin, raison d'etre, and most revealingly, its purpose within the legitimizing economy of contemporary practices, as a paradoxical category within the frame of art history, within the time of art history. For Smith, the paradoxical nature of conceptualism lies in the fact that it does not fit within the genealogy of its own time. That it is at the same time a term that refers to art that is precursory, contemporaneous, and derivative. In short, an art that, whilst its definition is based on the specificities of the historical moment and its geopolitical context, is celebrated as the bearer of a possible future differentiating significance of and for contemporary art practices. And I quote Terry Smith's remembering the exhibition Global Conceptualisms. I quote, "It is a nice paradox that the term conceptualism came into art world existence after the advent of conceptual art in the major centers such as New York and London. Most prominently and programmatically in the exhibition Global Conceptualisms, Points of Origin, 1950s to 1980s, at the Queen's Museum of Art in New York in 1999. Mainly in order to highlight the fact that innovative experimental art practices occurred in the Soviet Union, Japan, South America, and elsewhere prior to, at the same time as, and after the European and US initiatives that had come to be seen paradigmatic, and to claim that these practices were more socially and politically engaged, and thus more relevant to their present. better models for today's art. In these senses, better art. In this sense, better art than the well-known Euro-American exemplars. End quote. Conceptualism is translated into that specific hegemonic affiliation while being ascribed a particular form of praxis, one that imposes representation as its artistic method. That is to say, a language that is understood not as art, as conceptual art, but first and foremost through the representation of the political and ideological sphere, an art, in other words, exiled from the very language of art. Analyzing the historiography of the consolidation of the term, Miguel Lopez in 2010 suggested that conceptualism, as it has become normalized, brought into the mainstream, has come to deny the possibility of unearthing, and I quote, a multitude of not yet articulated and potential genealogies. Beyond the mere naming, these words appear as proof of the fact that there is something irreducible, a discordant crossing of stories that point to divergent ways of living and constructing the contemporary, its capacity to unfold over other times, end quote. Conceptualism, exiled from the context of its own art languages, thus presupposes that Latin American artists are disqualified from the reflexivity of their own specific genealogies, art historical genealogies. It is understood not in direct relation to Duchamp, nor through its relation, either through affirmation or negation, with its own specific genealogies. Instead, it is mediated or translated through conceptual art. However one desires to differentiate conceptualism from conceptual art, however one wishes to portray it as a mirror, an inversion, the relationship that is established through its very name, its improper name, in my opinion, presupposes a fundamental hierarchy. Thinking of this relation as translation, we are reminded of Walter Benjamin's argument that in translation, the original grows into a linguistic sphere that is both higher and purer, end quote. Despite all the negations proposed by conceptual art, the ideal of purity, however, remains like an umbilical cord that connects it to the very thing that it's rejected, Greenbergian notions of modernism. Kouzouv would claim, for instance, that the purest definition of conceptual art would be that of an inquiry into the foundations of the concept of art, end quote. Within the translation from an art of morphology, Greenberg, to an art of language, conceptual art, the ideal of purity not only remains, but is invested with the power of legitimacy. Conceptualism, as a translation of conceptual art, thus acts as the very affirmation of conceptual art's purported purity, if we read it through Benjamin. Conceptualism is contaminated in its translated condition, its condition of exile from the language of art. It is this very fact that enables, or at the very least makes credible, the absurd comparison of the art of one artist, Joseph Kouzouv, for example, as representative of conceptual art in general, with that of a multitude of practices within a subcontinent, Latin America. Conceptualism disguises both the heterogeneity of that which it defines, as well as that of conceptualism itself. Benjamin argues that the purpose of translation is, I quote, the expression of the most intimate relationship between languages, end quote. Such a relationship cannot be revealed by the translation, but merely represented. If, following the example of Kouzouv, the translation of the chair across different media reveals not the ideal reveals not the ideal itself, but that which is merely represented. In conceptualism, within this understanding becomes, therefore, a representation of its own relation with conceptual art. This relationship is substantiated, as Smith would have it, in the contemporary, in the here and now. Such a coming together of temporalities may be understood more broadly than in Osborne's understanding, by referring to Benjamin's claim that, I quote, "The history of great works of art knows about their descent from their sources, their shaping in the age of the artists, and the periods of their basically eternal continuing life in the later generations. Where it appears, the latter is called fame." So he's clearly talking about genealogies. Translations, and I continue to quote, "Translations that are more than transmissions of a message are produced when a work, in its continuing life, has reached the age of its fame. Hence, they do not so much serve the work's fame, as bad translators customarily claim, as owe their existence to it. In them, the original's life achieves its constantly renewed, latest, most comprehensive unfolding." End of quote. Conceptualism thus represents conceptual art's constantly renewed, latest, most comprehensive unfolding. In this Benjaminian sense, conceptualism owes its very existence to conceptual art. That is to say, those practices that the term conceptualism claims for itself exist in a state of exile from their own mother tongues and fatherlands, their own specific genealogies of or created languages. And as such, they are condemned to project the language of the other, the language of conceptual art, to project this onto the context that they claim for themselves, but where they no longer inhabit. Again, we are reminded of Benjamin, who claimed that, I quote, "translation indicates a higher language than its own, and thereby remains inappropriate, violent, and alien with respect to its content." Translation is translated here into the field of art, and as it is carried through or carried across, I realize that I am perhaps speaking out of turn, speaking of betrayal while committing the same sin. I am betraying an art language whose identity is built upon the translated form itself, perhaps, one that has grown to identify itself with its own foreign accent. The translated, after all, does not give in without a struggle. It drags its heels as it is carried through. It holds onto the vestiges of its own old self. It pollutes and contaminates its new host. It does not speak the lingua franca with ease, with the naturalness with which it speaks its own mother tongue. It carries with it an accent that is pronounced in speech and in the writing through the awkwardness of its native figures of speech. This accent and the foreignness that it invokes, for those whose mother tongue and fatherland belong to the lingua franca, become unifying characteristics of the multiple voices, the polyphonic tongues of those who have been translated. Benjamin himself affirms that it is necessary to translate despite its flaws, despite its inherent betrayal, or as Maurice Bolanshaw put it, despite its treachery. For to suggest the absolute untranslatability of one and the other is as absurd as suggesting the opposite, that one is the same as the other. Paul Ricoeur argued that the pure universal language that translation aspires to, but that cannot attain, is at the crux of the necessity to translate. It is its ultimate justification. And I quote Ricoeur here. "The dream of the perfect translation would gain without losing. It is the very same gain without loss that we must mourn until we reach the acceptance of the impassable distance of the peculiar and the foreign. Recaptured universality would try to abolish the memory of the foreign and maybe the love of one's own language, hating the mother tongue's provincialism. Erasing its own history, the same universality would turn all who are foreign to it, into languages stateless persons, exiles who would have given up the search for the asylum afforded by the language of reception. End quote. For Ricoeur, as Benjamin, one must translate the untranslatable. Such an impossible task is made possible by the translator who, in the very act of translating, reveals both the grandeur of translation and the risk associated with it through the creative betrayal of the original. The equally creative appropriation by the reception language and the construction of the comparable. These are all terms of Ricoeur's writing on translation. So yet, it seems that in the case of conceptualism, such constructions of the comparable fail to consider the reception language as Ricoeur, as the quote by Ricoeur clearly states. So so conceptualism, the construction of conceptualism fails to consider the reception language, the hegemonic context into which these other practices are translated, and through a tradition that is not their own, that of conceptual art, they become contemporary. Such a condition, that of contemporary art as post-conceptual art, seems natural only from within the art historical monolinguism, one that is deemed to possess a proper fatherland and mother tongue, one in which, as translators, we inhabit and thus find natural perhaps, ordinary, legitimate, and even pure. We must realize that it seems that when we speak of Latin American art, that singular category that holds a heterogeneous world, we are speaking the lingua franca. We are inhabiting it whether we claim it as our own or not. It is perhaps the only language, the only art historical frame that we possess. But we must beware that it is not the language of that which we claim for ourselves, that which, as art historians, we carry over through the acts of translation. This condition, and these are my concluding paragraph here, this condition, this fatal predicament in which we find ourselves, seems to be one of the monolinguism of the other, one in which a prothesis of origin becomes seemingly necessary, such as conceptual art as the prothesis of origin for contemporary art. Similarly to how Jacques Derrida described his own condition as a French-speaking Algerian Jew, we are condemned to speak a language that is not our own. It may be our only language, but it does not belong to us. It is in this fatal realization that resides the predicament and the very task of the historian of Latin American art. Thank you very much. The word to Fabrizio Poltronier, which I have no idea what he's going to say about it.
No idea.
No idea.
Okay, thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First, I would like to thank Dr. Asbury for the invitation to be here in the condition of respondent to his paper. Well, my response will briefly address these three main topics: language, aesthetics, and new old art. Language. Well, I do believe that is that the discussion that Michael brings with his paper is utterly connected to language. So, some semiotic concepts about language would be useful for us later on. Language and abstract thinking is of the symbolic nature, and this is very important. Symbols are particularly remote from the truth itself. They are abstracted. Symbols represent their objects independently alike of any resemblance or any real connection, because dispositions or factitious habits of their interpreters ensure their being so understood. A symbol is a sign which refers to the object that it denotes by virtue of a law. Usually an association of general, which operates to cause the symbol to be interpreted as referring to that object. No sign is a real thing. It has no real being, but only being represented. So, to translate means to switch between abstractions. Aesthetics. The discussion about conceptual / post-conceptual art is, of course, an aesthetical one, and it should be carried on the field of philosophy of art, aesthetics. So, first thing, an object to be aesthetically good must have a multitude of parts so related to one another as to impart a positive, simple, immediate quality to their totality. And whatever does this is, insofar, aesthetically good, no matter what the particular quality of the total may be. If that quality be such as to nauseate us, to scare us, or otherwise to disturb us to the point of throwing us out of the mood of aesthetic enjoyment, out of the mood of simply contemplating the embodiment of the quality, then the object remains nonetheless aesthetically good. This suggestion must go for what it may be worth, which, I dare to say, may be very little. If it be correct, it will follow that there is no such thing as positive aesthetic badness. And since by goodness we chiefly in this discussion mean merely the absence of badness, or fault, such a difficult word I put here, faultlessness, there will be no such thing as aesthetic goodness. All there will be various aesthetic qualities. That is, simple qualities of totalities not capable of full embodiment in their parts, which qualities may be more decided and strong in one case than in another. But the very reduction of the intensity may be an aesthetic quality. And more than that, it will be so, and I seriously inclined to doubt there being any distinction of pure aesthetic betterness or worseness. My notion would be that there are a number of varieties of aesthetic quality, but no purely aesthetic grade of excellence. But the instant that an aesthetic ideal is proposed as an ultimate end of action, as that instant a categorical imperative pronounced for or against it. Kant, as you may know, proposed to allow that categorical imperative to stand unchallenged, an eternal pronouncement. So I think that this is very important. in this case, because I'm not an art historian, of course, but I do believe that discussions about different kinds of art, for me, they always seem a little bit pointless. Because, as I just said here, there is an aesthetical component that, for me, all of these discussions just missed out. And Kant has the same opinion. So, new, old art. As something that I have to offer to you is some discussion about a peripheral kind of art that always dealt with translation, semiotics, and language, and also with conceptualism and post-conceptualism. Well, the first thing is a new language is not a made-up fiction ad hoc. It is new art. It reflects new categories of thought. Therefore, a new structure of reality. The actual Western crisis that Michael briefly spoke about is not the first one. This thing about the modernity and contemporaneity. The passage from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, for example, was another one. Possibly, we are on the verge of a new Renaissance. In those attempts, the modern age may be overtaken. So Levitt published paragraphs on conceptual art in Art Forum, June 1967. They became an influential theoretical text on art of the 20th century. They played the role of a manifesto, even though they appeared when their topic, concept over matter, had already existed for about a decade. Computational art had its first exhibitions in 1965. It seems it never produced a manifesto, with the exception, perhaps, of Max Benz's short Projekt generative Aesthetik, auf Deutsch, in German, Projects of Generative Aesthetics, in 1965. Since computer art is a brother of conceptual art, it is justified in a late manifesto to borrow the style of the old title. An art movement that is by now 45 years old and that has gone through a tremendous development cannot create ex posteriori its manifesto. However, a software manifesto was also written only after software and information technology had become the most important technology of our times. There are no images now with no trace of digital art. Digital art exists as computer art, algorithmic art, net art, web art, software art, interactive art, computational art, generative art, and more. When it made its first appearance in Stuttgart, Germany, and New York, United States, the name computer art was thrown against art history and into the face of art critics. It was a proud name and a bad one at the same time. Algorithmic art would have been the correct term because it deals with concepts. The superficial computer art disguised the revolutionary fact. The algorithm principle had entered the world of art. The algorithm principle is the principle of computability.
Whatever exists in the domain of computability exists insofar as it is computable. So, in that sense, all conceptual art is a computational one. In terms of language, that is the most important thing, I believe. The computer was about 20 years old when computer art appeared. Was it late? Was it early? No, it was in time. The times were times of deep social unrest. Ideas of the Cultural Revolution from Far East conquered young minds. The algorithmic revolution started its long march, overturning all the technological infrastructure. 3 years later, computer art was recognized internationally, not by the art history, neither by the art critics. In 1968, 2 exhibitions became the forerunners of the development of digital media. One was called Cybernetic Serendipity. The Computer and the Arts at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. The other one was Tendence 4, Computers and Visual Research, at Galeria Grade Zagreba, in Zagreb, Croatia. Serendipity established that the event component of digital media and linked it to the computing industry. Tendence established the research component of digital media and linked it to the world of art. Computing machinery is in its form as digital media incorporates 3 great principles: computability, interactivity, and connectivity. Computability appears in the arts as algorithmic art, a set of instructions, a set of mental lines, mental concepts, intellectual ones. Interactivity appears as interactive installations, and the later one, connectivity, appears as net art or software art. Computer art is almost entirely happening in the semiotic domain, in the domain of language. Algorithmic art has denied the concept of a masterpiece, and this is very important. This is to say that in computer art, there cannot be a masterpiece anymore in the traditional sense of the word. Each and every individual piece of computer art is no more than only one instance of the potentially infinitely many from the class of works defined by the program, by the software. The tragedy is that the program itself does not often show visual qualities. Its qualities are the potential to generate visual works. But each of its visual products is a shadow only of the program. It is one of its traits, a leftover, a consolation for those who need to see rather than think. Connecting again to Duchamp. If you want to find the masterpiece, you must compare the programs, the instructions. Critics and art historians are not prepared to do this. Nor is anyone else. Computer art is conceptual art and post-conceptual art. However, concepts in computer art are different from concepts in conceptual art. They here appear as operational descriptions. Algorithms are descriptions. They are finite descriptions of infinite sets. They are static descriptions of dynamic processes. These descriptions are operational and executable. They are text and machine at one time. as they are text and machine, they are also mind. When the computational artist designs a work, a program, he writes a static text. He may print the text on paper. This shows the text quality of the work. It is a quality for the human reader to perceive and acknowledge. But the textual description is also operational. It can be executed by a computer. When the computer executes the description, it reads it in its own peculiar way. It realizes exactly what the description requires each to do, and nothing else. Reading always is interpreting. The computer, when reading the operational text, interprets it, absolutely different from our interpretations. The computer's interpretation is a determination. No freedom allowed the computer interprets by determining the one and only one interpretation that makes algorithmic sense. Computer art is concept art insofar as it describes an idea and does not show the material work. However, since the descriptions must be operational or computable, the concept can be carried out immediately, without mediating medium. If the conceptual artist ever wanted to realize his description of an idea, he would need media of an appropriate kind to do so. Emerging at the same time as conceptual art, computational art, as the elder or younger brother clearly went beyond the confines of conceptual art. Concepts and conceptualizations had always been present in art, since without an idea, without a concept, art would not emerge, at least not in modern times. Conceptual art was another step in the continued modern reduction of the work of art. Conceptual art was this reduction reached the point of the concept or idea itself. No work exists without a concept at its root. So conceptual art, maybe it is a contradiction. As no work exists without a concept at its roots, in conceptual art, the concept is considered more important than its realization. Algorithm art goes the other way. Ideas and their descriptions in computer art must be codes that incorporate their own execution. Where conceptual art dances around the possibility of perhaps realizing peace and drawing pleasure from imagining it, computational art immediately delivers the conceptualized piece free of charge. It could go on realizing works of the same concepts for centuries. Harold Cohen, Manfred Moore, and Roman Verostko, and dozens of other computer artists know this. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. Exactly this, Gierso Levy, had happened some years before you wrote it. Insofar, computer art is the mother of conceptual art. Art critics and others should finally become aware of this when trying to study a phenomenon so alien to them. Computer art shares with conceptual art and some others a neglect of materiality. Computer art is conceptual art and post-conceptual art. Thank you very much.
Before we open up for questions and comments, etc., I'll just kind of no, I can put it else.
Entendi.
That you delivered exactly what I hoped you would deliver. I was kind of hoping that my provocation for you to respond to something that was kind of clearly outside of your field would kind of lead you to build a comparison and a differentiation between computer art and conceptual art. And I was hoping this would kind of establish an example, a kind of a counter-example of what I was talking in my paper. So I'm talking about genealogies that are outside that of conceptual art, that are brought forward into conceptualism, and that relation is established.
Yeah, I know, I read it.
And with computer art, it's the opposite. It has its own genealogy, but it has a clear relation with conceptual art by its very nature. But yet, it is completely separated. No one would kind of, even attempt to call it or bring it into the genealogy of conceptual art, even with the old ones. So there's a kind of, I was hoping that you would respond with a counter-example of what I was saying. But I think I'll just open up for if anyone has questions and comments.
Thank you both for really stimulating and I think quite provocative statements around conceptual art. Michael, I guess I wanted to draw a line between both presentations. I'm very interested in the journey from conceptual art to conceptualism, and you draw that genealogy through that very important exhibition in 1999, Global Conceptualism. So it's a journey in a way from a local context in some respects to a global context, in the way that exhibition is organised. But I'm quite interested, in a way I was a little bit, should we say, depressed, not depressed, but a bit, your conclusion is a little bit downer because you sort of say that you're very pessimistic, that in a way we're trapped eternally in a way in this kind of metaphor of translation, and in a sense have to accept a permanent state of exile, a permanent kind of othering in some ways, and that's, which is almost kind of very poetic in the kind of Pessoan way. I mean, Pessoa's kind of saudade, that kind of aesthetic is always there, which I think is an interesting part of perhaps that journey. But I wonder whether the computer art analogy and the idea of the algorithm offers some way of describing or substituting for translation as a way of thinking about that journey from the conceptual art to the conceptualism of today, and whether that is a more generative way, because algorithms are famously, and Fabrizio knows more than I do, a generative formation. They're unpredictable, although we know with the way that they operate at the moment, they can be controlled by organizations. But I wonder if there's something there, because I'm trying to get at the liberating potential which you actually state that conceptualism has over conceptual art. Okay, well, I'm interested in, one of my interests in conceptualism is particularly in its global context, in other contexts such as in Africa and of course Latin America, but in other contexts, and in the continuing debates about conceptualism, where there is a liberating potential, and whether, I'm just speculating here off the top of my head, probably talking complete rubbish, but whether there is something in the kind of algorithmic as a mode of, not translation, but as a way of moving away from the kind of strictures of translation.
Well, there are lots of points there. I'll start with the liberating potential, which relates to Osborne's definition of the contemporary, more than the post-conceptual. But what I found liberating in this idea of an anachronism of different but equally present temporalities is that it opens the possibility for you to think about art from other places other than the kind of the mainstream, the canon, however you want to call it, the centre, and relate to their own anachronisms as equally contemporary. So whilst Osborne is looking at a very strict and single time of art history, the time of art history for Osborne is the consensual, canonical art history that places Duchamp before abstract expressionism and then conceptual art, minimalism, etc. It is the time of art history that doesn't include these other temporalities. No? So his definition of the contemporary seemed liberating for me in that sense, but then he kind of disqualifies it by calling contemporary art post-conceptual art. But that's the kind of the premises of my kind of exploration of artist translation. That's kind of where it begins. Now I'll go to the end, which was where you began, which was the I can't remember which.
The idea of translation and the way that we're...
Yeah, the kind of monolinguism, the kind of inhabiting, the monolinguism was kind of the inhabiting of that single, unique time of art history, the place which Osborne actually inhabits, which seems natural. It's like a language. When you inhabit a language, when it's your language, language seems natural, but it is, as Fabrizio mentioned, like a conjunction of symbols, etc. So when we are writing about Latin America within a kind of European or North American context, when we are bringing Latin American art into that context, which is it's not its own context, we are inhabiting the time of art history. It is a kind of a place that is natural, seems natural to us, but it is not natural for the art. It is not the language of the art that we are bringing across. So I don't think it was kind of depressive, but more a kind of a statement of a particular condition in which, as art historians writing about Latin American art in Europe or the United States, it's a condition which we inhabit, and we must be aware that we are ourselves kind of speaking in a language that does not belong to us.
I understand that. I guess I'm trying to get at this liberatory element and the kind of whether there's a way in which that condition can be generative. And I'm trying to link to Fabrizio's analogy of computer, computational logic and algorithmic logic, which does correspond to the kind of contemporary moment that we're in, and whether there's something a bit more positive and generational and generative, about that language. If there's some kind of analogy there.
Look, I think that's a kind of a second level of that interpretation would be that there is no purity. We can't kind of search for a purity. We can't separate the kind of canonical from the peripheral, the centre, because we are in a global kind of situation. So that and that is part of this kind of acknowledging that translation is both impossible and inevitable, so that artists won't belong purely to their own specific genealogies, but they will relate to both their place and the global. And it is like in the actual practice itself, there is this kind of inevitable process of translating these two worlds, these two kind of linguistic spheres, if you like. Do you want to?
Yeah, just a few things. I think your question is a very good one, and of course a very complex one. And it's not up to me to try to give all the answers. But first of all, I always concerned with language as a semiotics, because I have got my PhD was in semiotics, and I have been researching this field for decades now. I'm very young, I
been doing this research for decades. And first thing, we are speaking here about freedom and language. Language cannot free us at all. Language is a prison. Language is a prison. Yeah, that's not only Flusser, but a couple of other thinkers and authors wrote that. And language is not natural at all. Language is culture. And this is the reason why we don't speak the same language as I am Brazilian. But we can communicate because as a cultural concept, we can share and learn these concepts. What happens is, in my opinion, the division between computational art and the history of art in general, including all the modern kinds of art or contemporary kinds of art, is related to language, to different domains of language. Art believes that the history of art, the traditional history of art, this term is terrible, I know, traditional history of art, but just to make this division clear here. The thing is, this traditional history of art believes that art is what kind of art is produced in terms of language at the end. And it doesn't see that it accounts that different kinds of language are also art. This is a problem. So again, it's a linguistic problem. It's a problem between language. And when I read several times Michael's paper.
I'm sorry for that.
Well, no problem. It was a pleasure. And the thing is, I was wondering, well, there is something that is happening now in the world, or has been happening, that makes us uncomfortable. And some people say this is the problem of the modernity, or a consequence of the modernity, because we don't live anymore in the modern age, in the modern times. But people usually think that we are still living in the modern times, in the modern age. And the term contemporaneity doesn't fit very well, because we are always, as far as we are still living, we are always living in the contemporary times. And this, but this silent revolution that has been happening, it's hard to grasp, it's hard to understand. And I think that this kind of artistic language has been addressing these issues for such a long time. And nobody says, okay, what kind of things, what kind of things have you been doing, your artists? And for example, if we take into account the last interview that Heidegger gave to Der Spiegel, it was published just only after Heidegger that left. Heidegger said, look, philosophy is dead now, and art also. Why? Because these two disciplines, especially philosophy, cannot explain the world anymore. Because now the world is so complex, and we don't have access anymore to the things. We cannot understand how things work. The philosophy is so useless because we cannot explain this world anymore. And the thing is, and then he made this statement. He said, so philosophy needs to be replaced by cybernetics, because just cybernetics can explain this world. And just to conclude, the thing is, we are condemned to language. We are in this prison, and this is the reason. This is not new, of course. This was the problem that Plato tried to address with the metaphor of the cave, for example. It's impossible to get out the cave, the prison of the language. So this is why I do believe that to translate means to switch between abstractions, because we are always living in some kind of abstraction, abstract reality. So it's possible, the only possible translation is to jump across these abstractions. And in this sense, again, this terrible word, traditional field of art is a kind of abstraction, and the computer art is another kind.
Questions? Can you wait till I need to?
Thank you both. I think it was quite important that you've mentioned the issue of symbolic. I think that's quite an important word in there in the whole context, because well, why modern art try to avoid totally the symbolic, isn't it? I think that while conceptual art went back to Duchamp, is that like, I'm no longer discussing this because we are finishing with the symbolic altogether and everything else, isn't it? Plain, color, everything. Just the idea, the pure idea is what is conceptual art. But I don't know whether that's we can escape out of it. I like your citation of Paul Ricoeur, because I think it's very nice, this idea of both translation and culture that Ricoeur studies, and then is your analysis of other contexts, for like the Latin American context of conceptual art. And then in terms of, again, thinking about temporality, when conceptual art arose here and in America, it was at the same time. I mean, this exhibition this year at the Tate on British conceptual art shows very clearly, and then I'm thinking about the exhibition I did about the 70s in Brazil, for instance, that what they were doing, all the artists after expressionism, abstract expressionism, was an international, I would think, rather than just translation, because at the time they were feeding into each other, and I think that ideological conceptualism was the case that informed the attitude of conceptualism altogether, whether that was more political or not. It was a political attitude, isn't it? And in that case, I think that conceptualism was already, or conceptual art, sorry, already post something, because it was new Dada. It was a recovery of Dada altogether, in a new, against art, or not just. So I don't know. It was very inspiring, because perhaps nowadays what is post-conceptualism is computer art.
Maybe, I don't know.
Maybe.
Just to say something, the whole idea about getting rid of the symbols, of the symbols, it sounds very strange to me, because without symbols, the end of symbols means the end of the human, the mankind, because we are symbolic creatures. We cannot live without symbols. So this is just another abstraction. This is just another fiction. This is that jump from a symbolic abstraction. Say, okay, the symbols, they are like, because the symbols, again, they are language. There is no language without symbols. There is no language. It's impossible. So the thing is, it's again an attempt to be free. Okay, this is something that is like holding me inside the language. So this is just an abstract from the semiotic point of view.
When I started, I mentioned that the paper emerged from a kind of mutual kind of relation with teaching in seminar context and the reading group, etc. But there is another source from where the problem that led me to kind of write the paper. So I was once invited to write about Brazilian conceptual arts for a reader that was going to be published on Latin American and Latino art in the States. Now, the kind of the association between a minority within a country and an entire continent or subcontinent already kind of made me feel uncomfortable. But I kind of accepted, and I started, well, first researching a little bit on kind of conceptual arts in a kind of more kind of broader way. And I came to the conclusion that it was deeply problematic to call an artist such as Fabrizio Poltronier, who they're often called within these kind of art historical kind of anthologies, etc., conceptual artists. Why? Because the entire kind of historical kind of or genealogical foundation of conceptual art is its rupture with Greenbergian analysis of abstract expressionism. Is it the rupture with abstract expressionism? It's something that kind of gives birth to almost simultaneously minimalism, conceptualism, and pop art. But these are kind of the three kind of reactions against that kind of type of reading based on Kant and the kind of form rather than the medium specificity, etc. Now, when you look at an artist such as Edward Signature Clark, that rupture, that kind of rejection simply doesn't exist. They emerge from a completely different tradition. They emerge from the constructive post kind of Second World War kind of revival of constructivism in the form of concrete and later neo-concrete art. So that there is no kind of rejection of form as happens with conceptual art instead. So already to call these artists conceptualist artists, for me it was very problematic because it did them a huge disfavor. It kind of disqualified some of the kind of the key characteristics of their work. And so I began thinking about how to kind of think about this problem, which kind of led me to translation. But yeah, I'm coming from a very different kind of perspective, and I thought that the combination of our very different languages would be interesting in terms of this concept.
Thank you very much for both interventions. So I wanted to return to the question of language and the possibility of a more liberating reading. I feel that coming from the same psychoanalytic tradition of being born into a language, but looking at more contemporary readings, we could look at the idea of coming from Butler's The Psychic Life of Power, that the process of subjectivation, of gaining a language, of being born into a language, it's both the process of becoming a subject that is gaining agency and being subordinated of power. And I think this is key to think about Latin Americans' relationship to Europe. We learn this language, we're born into it. It's not that it is, we cannot work with the division between cultural nature or language being constraining. Language is what we have and what we are in many senses. And we can never be nature. I feel that the relationship with this hegemonic tradition has not only been, of course, one of oppression and one of translation. The problem of translation would be that we need a source, and that kind of what haunted your paper, the idea of origins, of a language being alien or not, which of course it is a very fascinating discussion, but no easy to get out of it. But of course I agree with your anxiety of why there's a miscalling every time that we interpolate the Latin American art as conceptualist. There is an element that's shared in both traditions, I think rather horizontally, however, which is the rejection of the institution. That is, to me, present in all conceptualist Latin American artists, and this kind of almost positivist reflection on what is art. And just the last comment about your intervention, which I found is very interesting coming from a media theorist perspective, that every new media always supersedes all pre-existing media. So in a way, that could very well legitimize your claim that it otherwise would be perhaps rejected from a more like a historical point of view.
You are right. We are not nature. We are not nature. The language is a completely rupture. It marks a rupture for us as animals to the rest of the animal kingdom. But the thing about I don't. This is my personal opinion. I don't like the term media. The discussions that, for example, the field of media theory has been doing, I really not interested on. I think that this is a not good perspective on the issues that, for example, computer art and media art have been discussing for ages now. But the thing is, of course, when we have a new media, it does not just supersedes the old one, because it's not the way the culture works. Because culture, from the Latin cogliere, that makes a lot of sense in, of course, in Portuguese, Spanish, and in Italian. It means that we are, in fact, always collecting things that we cannot get rid of them, and we are always building things on the top of this cultural building, this cultural foundation. So it's impossible to say, like, now we have a new technology. And this is a problem. I was mentioned to Michael yesterday that now I am making a re-edition of a very important book published in this country like 20 years ago about explorations in art and technology. And the thing is, the book is completely outdated. Most of the book, like it has 25 chapters, and I had to drop like 20 chapters and invite new people to write. But the thing is, I asking people, please, if you write about technology itself, it's useless, it's pointless. Don't do that because you will not get approved this new edition of the book. Because the thing is, we need to give a step back and think about the concepts, about the thing. And this is something that, for example, I am an artist as well. Because I was giving my first computer, I was 5 years old. So since then, I have been writing computer code all of my life, basically. But the thing is, I really don't care as an artist, like with some kind of recognition from the art establishment about the computer art thing, because it has been like, the computer arts have been working for decades now without this recognition, and we don't need that. But the thing is, if, of course, some arts, they want that. But I say to them, look, if you want recognition, you cannot just speak about technology. Because this is something that we can borrow from the field of art, that we need to talk about concepts and about language. So it requires a step back. Of course, technology is important, but for example, you don't go usually to a conference about art and people start to speak about oil and because acrylic and this kind of, but computer arts, they do that. They do that. I thought, wow, it's pointless, because in 2-3 years we will have another technology, as we have the better pen inks now. So this is something that we as the computer artists and the scholars, as well, need to change.
Ash?
Thank you very much. Just an observation, maybe a question. I enjoyed both the papers. I'm not an art historian, which may be where a problem lies for me, in a sense. And you intimated this, Michael, I think. Well, I agree with your reading of Osborne, and I kind of totally, absolutely, I do think the contemporary Osborne is generative in the sense that it allows for these disjunctive temporalities to coexist and in a way opens up to more globalized possibilities that are not rooted in Europe as a starting point. But post-conceptualism is rooted in a very conventional art history. But the question, I suppose for me then, the issue then is, well, that one needs to provincialize art history and not necessarily try to translate into the concepts of Western-dominated art history. So the question is, and that's happening in other ways. I mean, I'm more familiar with Asia than Latin America, but you know, there's other histories of art, technology to be written, for instance, in Japan, which is not necessarily translatable as such at the moment because of the domination of Western hegemony, knowledge systems, institutions of art, the globalization of art still being rooted through globalized systems in which Europe wants to be part of the dialogue. Whereas if you go to Shanghai now, you get these conversations between Indians and Chinese and Japanese, where Europe is not necessarily a major player in that, in terms of trying to rewrite those histories of art, media, technology, culture, popular, da-da-da. And I just think one of the challenges for us here is to think about how one sort of decenters and provisionalizes our histories, claims for its universalism. I know that's an institutional problem as much as it is a sort of disciplinary problem, I suppose. But I think one of the is to sort of rethink that, and hence the conceptual, post-conceptual thing starts to become a small story in a way.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that, and in a way, maybe one needs to listen more ethically to other parts of the world's relationship to Europe, and maybe that requires a different sort of translation, I suppose, the whole set of institutional political translation. So I suppose I don't disagree with anything you say. I think translation is absolutely critical, and of course, those histories are also disjunctive.
Yeah.
You know, as you said, they're not pure as well, and the questions of translations are already happening in those historical spaces as much as here. So it is quite a complicated kind of history, but I suppose it's that provisionalizing the deeper histories to rewrite Europe's history from those other places is the way to sort of think about it, maybe.
But yeah, I mean, provincializing the canon is kind of something that I tend to engage with in comparing. Many of my publications have been comparisons of different moments and different places. So looking at minimalism in the States and neo-concretism in Brazil, which actually happened a decade before, by then. But looking at where are the similarities in their sources, what are the differences, in a way to kind of bring neo-concretism to a kind of a so-called mainstream kind of European kind of academic, whatever, but also provincialize minimalism at the same time. And if I can just make a plug, on the 15th of March, where Gustavo Grandal is organizing a symposium on concrete poetry in Britain and the world. And when you're talking about translation and the context in the Far East, etc., I remembered a recorded conversation between Edward Seeger and the concrete poet Haroldo de Campos, where Haroldo de Campos speaks of a translation by Ezra Pound of a Japanese no theatre play that is then kind of recounted by Haroldo to an artist, a Brazilian artist living in New York. So it's a kind of it's a story that kind of goes round the globe and kind of has this kind of transnational, very kind of over a very long historical span as well. So I don't know from what date the no theatre play actually dates, but Ezra Pound, I think, translated it sometime in the 20s or 30s, I don't know exactly. But this is then kind of recounted in the 1970s, and then which leads on to works later on that decade. So it's a kind of a story that kind of has a long kind of transnational trajectory. Yeah, so that reminded me of the symposium on concrete poetry and concrete arts on the 15th. Everyone's welcome. I think there's a registration, but it's on the events at UAL site.
Okay, we've got time for one more question from Maria, and then I'd like to continue. We can continue this conversation over some wine, and kind of, you know, I'm sure there's many more questions that we want to raise.
Yeah, thank you for that very dense language which you talked with, very interesting one. My problem actually comes from a very visual point of view as an artist. I'm kind of working with a symbol, which is a visual symbol, which is the whale, and also the words. And the associations, when it comes from one place to another, how it's translated, or how it's understood or communicated, or me as the translator, and how it is possible to actually decentralize main kind of perceptions of what we see as symbols, whether it's in words, whether it's in visuals, and how it is possible to actually find constant somewhere in between, in terms of how we associate words or forms within very particular contexts and histories, whether it's possible to actually, rather than translating from one language to another, or having constants or binaries, whether it is possible for us to just consider each language that comes across at any given point of time as anotherness, as just another point, a new contemporary take, kind of translation, and each one having the same value as any other language or any symbol. Am I making sense? I'm not. Or is this too complex?
I'm not sure if I understand. I think the problem with considering other languages is that if, in order to consider, you need to speak them. So you need to already leave one prison and go into the other. But if you're confronted with lots of foreign languages that you don't speak, they are all equally mysterious, obscure. So already by kind of engaging with the language and understanding however little you understand, you're already crossing into another kind of prison, as Splusa would say.
I live in a situation every day here.
But so there is it's the kind of this relation that I'm calling translation, but you couldn't call it something else, is inevitable. You need to I think Malcolm wants to.
I just want to say something quickly. On that note, it does relate to both these issues. I'm going to have to go to Ken Walsmore and grapple with David Hume's anti-Muslim sentiment in The Standard of Taste. And that's interesting because Hume says, well, the reason this Quran is not good from my point of view is because it uses language that seems to profess something that doesn't relate to what I'm interested in, which is fine sensibility. In other words, these words are meaningless unless we know what sentiments they attach to. And thus the foundation of culture for someone like Hume is, well, yeah, philosophy comes and goes, but great works endure, and we will have culture and we'll have it by a sensibility. So if you want to get Maria to, where you get something different, you're going to have to undo most of what's happened in the past 200 or 300 years.
You don't have to get rid of something, because it is impossible to get rid of a whole lot of history and understanding.
Yeah.
But it is possible.
Yeah.
It is
well,
possible.
one more point, and it's in my last point. That if you're talking about algorithms, currently we are worried because algorithms seem to rob us of our taste. Amazon tells us what to read, etc., etc. This is interesting because we now have an opportunity via the stuff you were talking about to say, this taste thing you've been working with, actually what is it? What does it do? What purpose does it serve? So rather than simply saying I prefer Amazon to my own choices, we can look at that relationship.
Yeah. But this was the problem that Heidegger
Yes.
put like
Exactly.
3
Can
decades
I-
ago.
Can I ask you perhaps both just to round up your final comment from you both, just to summarise the event, and then we can go for some drinks.
I think we can just go and have some wine. So I think, thank you for your questions. I think we've had a, do you want to have a final word as a respondent?
Why not?
I can speak for hours, guys.
A short kind of comment.
No, seriously. I just want to thank you, Michael. I know Michael, I don't know, for 10 years now, and we are always talking about these things, about Brazilian art and about art in general. And I think that it was great to discuss these issues. They are not issues, but at this point, like in a public event, and I hope that we can build bridges between our researchers and our centers as well, and to do more events like this one, that they are very, very important, and we need to discuss these problems because they are central to our times. And I just want to thank you. Thank you, Paul. I just met you today, but I think that we get along very well here.
Thank you very much. We certainly do. I'd like to thank you, Fabrizio. Obviously, thank you, Michael. Also, just to take up Fabrizio's point, that TrAIN is, I think, the forum to continue these conversations. And Michael's stream of events, Contemporary Art in Latin America, is a strand that we'll be developing. I'm sure Fabrizio will welcome you again for that. Thank you all for coming, and then please join us for a drink downstairs.
E aí, meu? Tudo bom?